What is God's agenda for America? That has been a question that has driven me for 3 years now. Perhaps better said, I believe that is a question God has driven into me. As I record this first of a 40 video series, I wince at the weight of this task set before me. I've already poured hundreds of hours and thousands of dollars into this effort. I'm exhausted physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And I haven't even begun to turn the bend for the last lap of the race. But I've been driven by the words God gave me in 2017, ambiguous words I received 1 year before ever embarking on the prophetic journey of a lifetime. He said, "I want you to tell the whole story, because it will be a foundation of hope to many." At that time, I assumed he was speaking about my own story. But it is for this reason I have kept going, kept preparing the ark, so to speak, for 3 years amidst endless delays and a deep longing to just cross the finish line and enter into that rest. It is because this is not my story. It is his. Why have I buried myself in this work these 8 months since the release of my first God's Agenda series the day before the 2020 presidential election? One thing has kept me going. The belief that he has prepared me for 25 years to ask America to consider this one question: what is God's agenda for America? And then to invite you on this journey with me to find out for yourself. Looking back now, I can hardly believe this journey I've been on these last few years. When God says, "As high as the heavens are above the earth, so much higher are my ways than yours," he's not kidding. In the 3 days prior to November 25th, 2020, my original What is God's Agenda for America video series capped at just over 3,000 views. In the 3 days prior, my daily views had dropped from 10 to 7 to 3. It was essentially dead and buried, as were Donald Trump's hopes for re-election. And then, the Pennsylvania town hall meeting happened. For me, that will go down as the day it all began. The day God gave birth to the late Great Awakening. If I thought creating the first 17 video series was a momentous feat, creating the sequel has been nothing short of epic. I'm not sure how to explain the awe and wonder of telling one of the greatest stories ever told, before it unfolds, as it unfolds, by linking together prophecies that foretold it weeks, months, years, in some cases even decades in advance. Again I say, it has truly been an epic experience, and yet one that has challenged me to the very core. As I record this first video on May 15th, some 192 days after the election, and still with no significant change in the political landscape, I gasp at the grave improbabilities of it all, and yet continue to do what I've been doing for the last 192 days since. I just keep going. But first, the backdrop. For those of you who listened to my first 17 video series, you may remember some of the story. In March 2018, the Lord compelled me to take a leap of faith and step into my 14-year teaching career to write a story of a modern-day Abraham. The idea was wild, to say the least. I was going to scour my journals and dare to write my 20-year-plus autobiographical account from the first time I received a prophetic call in my life in January 1998 to the point of God fulfilling his promise 20 years later. I even set an end date, November 5th, 2018, by 5 p.m. I don't think I'll ever forget the waning moments of writing that book. Sitting in my bed, with laptop out and fingers on keyboard, I stared soberly at the clock, waiting for the inevitable. The number's 4:59, frozen for half an eternity, and then, finally striking 5. I stared at my computer, numb and baffled, and then scribed these final 3 words. It is finished. And with that, my autobiography was done, as was my bizarre faith journey, as was the $25,000 I had in my savings account when I first endeavored to take this ridiculous leap of faith in the first place. Well, Jesus, I conclude, I followed you all the way out into the middle of the Jordan River, only to be left here to drown. I closed my laptop, hopped in my car, drove to a nice restaurant to celebrate my book's completion with a steak dinner and a quiet conversation with the Lord. And well, submitted myself to the grave. What do you do when you sacrifice everything to follow a dream God puts in your heart and then end up lamenting alone in the shattered glass of that dead dream. You find freedom. I had lost seemingly everything. My job, my savings. God knows I lost my reputation. Most people, even faith-filled Christians, thought I had flown completely over the cuckoo's nest. But my God, the experiences I had with him in that season. I must have wept dozens of times in those months of writing. Wept because of the explosive nearness of his presence. Wept because of the awe of tying all these random prophetic puzzle pieces of my life together. Wept because of the exhilaration of walking by sheer stupid faith. And in the end, I stepped out and wrote my entire life story, believing God would miraculously write my happy ending. He did not. I wrote a best-selling book with the dumbest ending ever. A glorious build-up with an abrupt dead end. The words, "It is finished," was the final pronouncement. God had failed. He failed as he had failed Jesus when Jesus breathed his last and was lowered into the ground. Now I'm being facetious because I both know what followed Jesus' death, and I now know what followed my own. You see, the ending of one story merely became the backdrop for the beginning of another. Little did I know that the ark that I had built in 2018, waiting for God to bring the flood of blessings into my own life, was the preparation to build a second ark for the nation at large 2 years later. What the blazing saddles am I talking about? Well, let's go on a journey together and find out. I said I finished my autobiography on November 5th, 2018. What I did not tell you is that I finished another document on September 9th, just 2 months earlier, called What is God's Agenda for America? For the sake of time, I'll skip the whole play-by-play of how that all enveloped, but in short, on August 22nd, 2018, for only the second time in my life, a word welled up in my spirit and I began to write. Not for myself or for another person, but for the nation at large. These were the words that followed as I typed on my keyboard. Just as Donald Trump and his plans seem to be surrounded, just as impeachment seems more inevitable now than ever, God says, "Watch me now crash the Red Sea upon this great army that pursues me, and let this serve as a sign to my body. I am coming in power, but the enemy is about to be served. I have allowed him to set the gallows so that I can reverse the curse and hang him on the very gallows that he has set for this great nation and for my people." 8 days later, I felt compelled to temporarily shelf my own book and write a research paper chronicling prophecies concerning God's plans for America, the next Great Awakening, and yes, our unorthodox and often controversial president, Donald Trump. I first turned to the Elijah List, a website that showcases the prophecies of more than 100 prophets in both America and abroad. The most recent word was a dream released by Christy Johnston just hours earlier. In the dream, she was standing on the second floor in the middle of the White House, praying when she heard trumpets blare. She saw a flood of people congregating around the front lawn to see the ceremony. She continued, "As I looked over the Truman balcony, I saw what the celebration was all about. 2 very prominent talk show hosts were on stage in prison uniforms and handcuffs. Then she heard a loud voice that exclaimed, 'Let my justice prevail.'" Now, if you're anything like me, you're already getting excited. Wait a minute. The Red Sea crashing on Pharaoh's head, trumpets blaring from the White House, 2 talk show hosts ready to be judged? I can interpret this. Yeah, you probably can. Because in the months following the release of my first 17-part YouTube video series, we have all been taken on a grand journey far beyond anything any of us could have ever fathomed. Well, if you think the prophetic pieces are starting to come together and provide clarity now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Back to the story. That was prophecy number 1. 10 days later, I had written a 26-page research paper chronicling the prophecies of more than 50 individuals. 16 of those prophecies were about the man Donald Trump himself. Several more, though never mentioning him by name, now that we have greater hindsight, seem to have spoken into the very times we have just seen and are now beginning to see with greater clarity. In my eagerness, I created a group on Facebook Messenger and sent it out to 144 Facebook friends. Some people read it. A few offered encouraging feedback. But for the most part, it fell on deaf ears. I sounded the alarm and started a prayer group. For weeks, we averaged a hefty attendance of, 3. In short, all my efforts fell to the ground and died again. And yet, I have learned that God's greatest works emerge from the ash heap of broken dreams. A few days after Christmas 2018, my old prophetic friend that I had not heard from in years sent me a dream. He said, in the dream, you received a new burgundy red BMW 318i. I knew that the car represented a new ministry or vocation, which was great because by this point I was dead broke. The I, which he said was lowercase I, made me think of Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live, I live by faith. I said, he is the subject of the sentence now, I am the object. He's the big I, I'm the small I. He must become greater, I must become less. And with that, I thought, well, maybe the 3:18 refers to the same book of Galatians. I turned to Galatians 3:18 and read, for if the inheritance depends on the law, then it no longer depends on a promise. But God, in His grace, gave it to Abraham through a promise. I stepped out of my 14-year teaching career in faith that God would open up the next door. And 3 weeks after my friend's dream, and 7 months after I stepped out of my teaching career, He did. It was a job of all things teaching U.S. history at a Christian high school in California. The sense of irony was awe-inspiring as the beauty of the position. It very quickly became my dream job, so much so that after 4 months there, I put my condo on the market and relocated closer to my new school. When it was all said and done, I sold my house, paid off all my debts, paid off the renovations on the home, paid off the realtor and closing costs, put 20% down on a home I liked better than the first one with a much closer commute, filled my new home with new furniture, and still had $50,000 left in the bank. The $25,000 savings I saw dwindle down to nothing doubled 1 year later. This was the backdrop after moving into my new home on December 7th, 2018, and spending the rest of the month furnishing it and catching a vision for the year ahead. Never had I anticipated any given year like I had 2020. Yes, my own story fell to the ground and died, but out of the ashes arose a job and a ministry, a home and a financial prospect that was greater than anything I'd ever known. But all that paled in comparison to the bigger storyline playing out before. As the calendar page flipped to 2020, and the presidential election was now less than a year away, I knew a prophetic time of convergence was near. One of the most intriguing words was a prophecy of the late great prophet Clement, who had given it on June 14, 2014. At one point, he gets quite mystical and says, "Summer reaches to spring and to fall. I will be the mediator," says summer. "I will uncover. I will defend. My sun will shine, but yet beneath the earth there is a rage, eruptions." Summer says, "Why choose they me? Why do the hurricanes and tornadoes choose me? I am summer. I bring smiles. I bring sunshine. I bring warmth. And yet there is a tumultuous rendering that is coming. I stand to protect spring, but fall, you are rebelling." He continues. "Or is it possible that the Spirit of God will cause many to fall and fall? Then there is the earth that wishes to tremble and shake, for the nations of the earth stand waiting. He is quiet. He shall not return. This God is too quiet, but my mercy endures forever. However, there is an uncovering of great evil, and I will start from the top. I have shaken the Democrats and will shake the Republicans even more. But remember, when these tremors and when these tumultuous actions happen, summer will say, I will take it so that the fall can do its work in America." Finally, he concludes, "And in the fall I will show you whom I have chosen to pray for and guide this nation. You shall rejoice, for it is my man. It is my chosen David, says the Lord." Whew, wow, right? And was Kim referring to summer 2020 or summer 2021? With the election in the fall of 2020, one could have only concluded the answer was obvious, but if we're believing that the election results will be overturned and that Trump will return to office, then perhaps he's speaking of now. And if so, are we talking about literal physical shakings or spiritual? Stay tuned, because we're all watching the same story unfold together. All right, 2 prophets down, about 100 to go. The first sign that 2020 would be a year like none other was revealed at my homewarming party on New Year's Day. My friend Heather shared a dream she had recently. It was a dream of an angel filling the whole sky blowing a trumpet. Sounds a bit like Christy Johnston's dream I shared earlier, right? Now, if you don't possess Joseph's gift of dream interpretation, and you're itching for a little analysis, I assure you it's coming. In the videos that follow, you will see an unraveling of the mystery and a piecing together of the prophetic puzzle with depth, cohesion, and clarity that will leave everyone in awe. But patience comes to those who wait. We still have more context to present first, both in my own story and the story of this nation at large. Several days later, I was assigned to give my first full-fledged sermon to the high school student body on the first day of the second semester, January 7th, 2020. In retrospect, it's amazing I was able to have the composure I did because of the absurdly bizarre experience I had just 3 hours earlier at Starbucks. As I was driving out of the parking lot, a car started driving right at me. As I stared, baffled by what I was seeing, he sharply swerved 15 to 20 yards from me and skidded out of the parking lot. What the hell was that, I pondered. It was literally as if Satan had hired a hitman and he got cold feet at the last minute. Anyway, these were the thoughts I pondered as I stared at the back of the room at the clock for the first time toward the tail end of my sermon. In big red letters, the clock read, 10:10. It was as if time had stood still. Everything in me instinctively knew God was speaking to me from John 10:10. The enemy will come to steal, to kill, and to destroy in 2020, but I have come that you might have life and life abundant. That word carried me when COVID-19 shut down the school year and drove us into a historically unprecedented global lockdown. That word carried me when the death of George Floyd provoked riots and violence that would continue for months to follow. The intensity of these events drove me into desperate prayer and prophetic pursuit. In April, I wrote a 26-page research paper titled, What is God's Agenda for America? Part 2, the prophecies from September 2018 to March 2020. In May, I began to catch a vision for a Facebook group page where I would unravel one prophetic puzzle piece a day for 70 days to help give people clarity into the days we were now living. Later that month, I also caught the vision for a YouTube video series with the same title as the 2 research papers I had previously written. In June, I started my Facebook group page and finished the rough draft for a video series that eventually spread out over 17 videos. In July, I started to record, and on August 22nd, the 2-year anniversary of the original prophetic word God gave me for America, I released the first video. Over the next 9 weeks, I released another video every 3 to 7 days before finally releasing the final video to public on November 2nd, one day before the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election. If I felt like Noah building the ark in preparation for the flood when I stepped out of my teaching career to write my life story in 2018, I felt nothing short of the weight of the world on my shoulders as I went to sleep that night. If Donald Trump lost the election, it would not only completely discredit me and leave all my works as rubble in the ash heap of my broken dreams, it would discredit the entire prophetic movement as well. No pressure there. Actually, the pressure was far greater still. First, the 17 video series foretold far more than Donald Trump's re-election. If he failed to win in 2020, not only would the prophecies of his re-election be proven bunk, but really the prophecies, now numbering dozens, if not well over 100, would also be proven bunk. After all, so many of the prophecies that seemed to be fulfilled when Trump was elected in 2016 were, at best, fulfilled in part. All the prophetic pieces to the puzzle connected to a much larger storyline that still had not come to pass. But again, the pressure was greater still. You see, it wasn't enough for Trump merely to win re-election in 2020, a hope challenged by a prevalent media projection of Biden winning by 7 to 10% of the popular vote. His victory had to give way to massive exposures and uprooting of long-seated political, economic, and media strongholds in this nation. It had to give way to the late Great Awakening. By the time I reached the 10th video in the series, it began getting more intense with each passing video. The prophecies that surfaced in 2020, like the year itself, became bolder both in exposing evil and in unveiling God's promised glory. The last 2 videos in this series literally left me staggering. They were so intense. In fact, I didn't merely have trouble sleeping the final night before the election. I had trouble sleeping every night for months before the election. Thankfully, by this point, my entire video series only had 800 views. But I knew that if God did what I believed He would, there'd be no limits to the potential this very amateur presentation held. After all, my vision from the beginning was to testify of the God who speaks the end from the beginning, so that when it comes to pass, we will know that it was He. If God fulfilled the words of this 17-video series, even just in part, it would inspire awe. If He brought all the prophetic pieces together and fulfilled the bigger picture, this video series would have the potential to reveal God as the architect behind it all. And so, amidst paralyzing fears of unveiling dreams that revealed major world leaders by name, warned of a communist agenda that was secretly masquerading as a Trojan horse, and prophecies of such blinding glory that it would dwarf every revival before it, I felt overwhelmed by the weight these prophecies carried. So many mornings I was tempted to pull the whole series and cut my losses, but one prevailing thought kept me going. What if God truly is the author and perfecter of the story? What if I have the opportunity to tell one of the greatest stories ever told, before it ever happens? What if I can take everything that happens in the months and years to come and point people back to Jesus as the hero of the story, and in such, help usher in the greatest harvest of souls that the world has ever seen? These were the thoughts that filled my anxious mind as I dozed off to sleep on the evening of November 2nd, 2020. I had invested everything to build the ark. The only question now was whether God would send the flood in return. Now, fast forward to the present, or at least 6 months into the future. As I record this first video of a 40-video series, it is May 15th, 2021. I've just received word that the state of Wisconsin has authorized an audit of the 2020 election results. Meanwhile, the long-anticipated Arizona audit has just been suspended. For 6 months, I've read articles, seen documentaries, and watched one piece of evidence after another filter in suggesting Trump will return and that justice will be served. And yet, I continue to wait. But wait in action. I have now written the content for 33 videos, revised the first 12, and now record the first. I'm not sure how to describe the feeling of preparing an ark for a flood when all you see are sporadic drops of rain. I suppose it feels like faith. What is God's agenda for America? Let's go on a prophetic journey together and find out.